Hello, my Psychians. So currently you're taking your test for 1A right now. So I'm just sneaking in our last little video lecture. So I don't have a Diet Coke, but I have moved on to coffee and it's bright outside again. So let's get started. So our last little module today is about language. And it used to be a different chapter in our old textbooks, but this one really, I like how it interwove it within our cognition unit. So language. What does language have to do with thinking, right? So it's language is our spoken, written, or gestured word. It is a way we communicate meaning to ourselves and others. Can you imagine a life without language? I mean, that is our main, communication system. And so within the language structure, we got to start with the basics, okay? So we have the smallest distinctive sound unit in a spoken language is called phonemes, okay? So phonemes are the smallest distinctive sound unit in a spoken language. So for example, bat has 3 phonemes, b, a, t, right? And then chat has 3 phonemes, ch, a, t, right? So again, just the smallest basic sound unit, okay? Smallest basic sound unit. And on top of phonemes, we have morphemes. And morphemes, my mnemonic for it is morphemes meaning, M and M. Morphemes are the smallest unit that carries meaning, maybe a word or a part of a word. So again, morphemes carry meaning. And so it could be, so milk, right? So milk carries meaning, right? So imagine phonemes lead up to morphemes. They create meanings, right? So words create meaning. All right, we have phonemes, we have morphemes. And when we think of structuring language, this is a good way to see it. So we have phonemes, which are the basic sound. We have morphemes, right? And then we slowly develop words, right? So you can even think about it as children learning to say things, right? So first they start to babble, which is all these random words, right? And then morphemes start to add meaning. And so a lot of kids start with words. It's like go, sit, food, right? And then they start to turn into phrases, right? And then they'll turn into sentences, right? It's a nice little steady progression. And so we have to have rules in language, right? Or else it would be too chaotic. So grammar is a system of rules in a language that enables us to communicate with and understand others. So grammar is the rules in a language. Simple as that. Grammar is the rules of a language and how we structure it and how we talk about it. And within grammar, we have 2 sub little headings. We have semantics and syntax, and they do 2 different things within our grammar structure, right? Because grammar is our rules of a language. So within grammar, we have semantics. And semantics are a set of rules by which we derive meaning from. So imagine semantics as the ruler of the morphemes. So semantics are rules for morphemes, okay? So for example, a semantic rule tells us that we have to add ed to the end of the word to tell us it's in the past. So we laughed, right? Or we, walked, right? Because if we add the ed, just like the semantic rules of meaning, it adds meaning to the word and we know that it happened in the past, right? And so ed itself is a morpheme because it changes the meaning of a word. It changes it to past tense, right? And let me get out of your little screen so you can write down the rest. The rule that says adding ed makes a word past tense is a semantic rule for grammar. So think again, right? So think that semantics are the rulers of the morphemes, okay? Semantics are the governor of the morphemes. They tell us what we can and cannot do, okay? All right. And then we have syntax, right? So syntax is also a ruler. So it's the rules for combining words into grammatically sensible sentences. So think of syntax as the rules of creating sentences, okay? And so for example, in English, a syntax rule is that adjectives come before nouns, so white house, but in Spanish, it's reversed. Casablanca, right? So house white. And so poor Miss H, I got a degree in English, right? And parts of the reason I had a really hard time understanding the Spanish language is that I could memorize vocab all day long, but when it came to creating sentences, the syntax of the sentence just blew it was complete opposite, right? So just like we have syntax for English, right? We have syntactical rules for sentences. We say the adjective before the subject, right? But in Spanish, it's switched, right? So think of syntax as the rules of sentences. The rules of sentences. We just have a subject and a verb, right? So we have, and there's different orders, right? All right. We're getting a little bit of an English lesson. This is why I always enjoy it. So language development. So we are going to learn more in detail about language development in our development chapter. Okay, so we have a whole chapter. It's massive, and it's about development from birth all the way to when you pass away and you move on, right? So children learn their native languages much before learning 2+2. We learn an average, so they say after the age of 1, 3,500 words a year, right? Up to 60,000 words by the time you graduate high school. And so kids, they start babbling, right, which we'll talk about, and they're already trying to say all these languages that they're hearing and these sounds, right? There's a reason that we can tell, who are native speakers of English versus other, people who are not, and vice versa. When I went to, if I practice Spanish, I still have an English accent to it, right? Because some of the words that we create with our mouths as native speakers, it's hard for us to relearn them or to learn them at a later age, right? So when do we learn language? We have the babbling stage with this cute little baby. And so beginning at 4 months, the infant spontaneously utters various sounds like goo, right? It's babbling. They just start babbling like, right? And it's not the imitation of adult speech until about 9 or 10 months, but they're just trying to say anything that they're hearing, right? But usually babies around 9 or 10 months, it's called pruning. It's when they start to take away all the neural pathways that they're not using in their house. So, say that the baby is hearing a bunch of languages, but in the house, they only speak English and Spanish. The baby's going to start to take away all the other sounds that aren't being used, and they're going to focus on what's being used in the house, right? And that's where they're going to start to babble actual words or attempt to, right, around 9 or 10 months. So we have the babbling stage, and then we have the one-word stage. So beginning at around 1 year old, a child starts to speak one words. It's like the word doggy may mean look at the dog over there, right? So like doggy, and they like point or something, right? So usually they begin with short words that begin with consonants like B, D. So that's why it's always big like mama and dada, right? But to be fair, kids have an easier time pronouncing dada than mama. So at least the da, it comes pretty quickly, the D. And so that one's always funny. But however, children can understand quite a bit of language they hear at and before the stage, right? There's no set time that a baby does something, right? It's continuous and it can change, right? And we'll talk about that in development. So we just got done with the one-word stage, and of course we have the two-word stage. You're like, oh my gosh, Miss H, is there going to be a 5-word stage? Who knows, right? So 2-word stage. So before the 2nd year, a child starts to speak in 2-word sentences. And this is called telegraphic speech. So go car, ride bike, eat more, or so it's when they start connecting 2 words together, and it's called a telegraphic speech phase. So I always think of telegraphic, two words, telegraphic, T and T, right? That's a good mnemonic for us to remember that one. And so no, there is not a 5-word stage, but the longer phrases start to develop, just like we learned at the beginning of our little lesson, right? So it's like we start with the basics of phonemes, and then morphemes, and then we start to learn little words, and then phrases, and now we're on to sentences, right? So after telegraphic speech, children start to uttering longer phrases like mommy get ball, daddy pick up, right? But, all these syntactical sentences by the early elementary school, they're enjoying, right? So, there's, you always hear these happening in kindergarten, but that's why they go through like their sight words and they start using longer phrases, right? And it's usually about the time they start before elementary school or not elementary school, kindergarten, pre-K, around that time. And that's also, we'll talk about preschool later, but preschool definitely, there's a high correlation with, kids' success when they go to preschool or not, because they also start to get ready for the school atmosphere, right? Because they're learning how to sit in a chair. They're, learning what are the rules of the classroom, right? So the sooner they start learning that, the better, and they'll start acquiring it, right? Skinner, what? How do we learn language? So how does Skinner play a role? Oh my goodness. So Skinner, he believed that we learn to talk through operant conditioning. So language development can be explained on the basis of learning principles such as association, imitation, and reinforcement. So this is definitely when kids start, so if you ever been like near a kid who's trying to say, you try to like say like, can you say, walk or talk, right? But they're trying to imitate your face, right? So that's why like when you're smiling, they're smiling, right? When you're crying, they're crying, right? So this definitely has a little bit of an operant role, right? So children learn to speak because being rewarded for making sounds that are close to adult speech. So have you ever seen like a parent's like, you said walk, like, or, so we positively reinforce when babies start to babble and they're like, I want that again, right? So even from the youngest age, we're starting to condition, right? And we do want to know Chomsky. So Noam Chomsky, you don't need to know his first name, but it's Noam. So Noam Chomsky, he doesn't really believe in Skinner's ideas. And of course, so we have Skinner's idea about language, and Chomsky has something that is called the LAD, which is the language acquisition device. So Chomsky didn't believe in Skinner's viewpoint, and he suggested that the rate of language acquisition is so fast, so we acquire language so fast that it must be innate. It must be inborn. Chomsky believes that we are born with an LAD device, so a language acquisition device in our brain that automatically starts queuing us up to learn language. Because if you think about it, we're never we're never prompted to learn, so Chomsky believed that we are born with the ability to start acquiring language because we are social human beings, right? We have to communicate. So it supports the idea that language has a universal grammar. So, similarly underlining structures of all world language, we all need to communicate, right? So again, here's our little vocab term. I'll get my little camera out of the way. So this is where it believes in the presence of a language acquisition device, and it's a neural network within our brain that allows us to understand language, and it's switched on by exposure to language in our environment. And we'll talk about this in class one day, but we're going to learn a little bit about Jeannie and what she taught us. It was an extreme abuse case, and the dad thought that she was on the spectrum. And this was like back in the 80s. I forgot if it was in the 70s or 80s. But he locked her in a room for the first 13 years of her life. And she never acquired language. I want you just to think about that and just hold on to that because we're going to talk way more about it later. But this is where we learn a lot of information because we can't redo this experiment because it's highly illegal, right? But we're going to talk about it in class. And so how do we learn language? And so Jeannie taught us about this critical period. Well before our first birthday, our brains are discerning words, breaking by, we're analyzing syllables, but statistical analysis has learned that we have to start learning language during a critical period of child development. And what Jeannie taught us is there is a certain age that if you have not acquired a native language, your first language, it will be hard to acquire one after a certain point. So very similar to, I have a really strong belief after I learned psych, after I had been teaching psych for so long that we shouldn't be learning second languages in high school. We should be learning in elementary school because our brains are wired when we are young to take in many languages because we're learning them for the first time, right? But after a certain point, it gets harder to learn a second language, right? And these are called critical periods or a first language, right? So again, hold on to that. We're going to talk a lot about it next time, okay? And so language and thinking, what influences what? So we have Benjamin Whorf. We do want to know Whorf. He is the one who came up with linguistic determinism, which is a vocab word. And Language influences thinking. So linguistic determinism, it suggests, and it's a hypothesis, right? So it suggests that language determines the way we think and perceive the world. And I just want you to think, so for all my bilingual learners out there, do you think differently when you're talking in a different language? That's my question for you guys. And usually when I'm in a classroom, a lot of people say yes. There's different cultural rules. There's a different presence. Some people say that, when they talk in Spanish, they're a little more assertive than when they're in English or vice versa. Language is a part of identity, right? So when we switch languages, it might change how we perceive the world, right? And on the other end, when a language provides words for, objects or events, we can think of these objects more clearly and retain them. So for example, it's easier to think about a man being a police officer than a woman when they all know to call an officer a policeman. And it's hard to then comprehend the possibility of a woman filling a role. And these are just reasons of how our language shapes our thoughts, right? And when we think of the Spanish language, for example, it's feminine and masculine, right? It's interesting what words they put under feminine and masculine, la or el, right? It's just really interesting to think about, right? And so this is the last little slide for our language, but I hope you found it interesting, and we'll talk about it more in class. This is the last video. You made it, you got it, and take a break now, and you can hate me all you want, but I hope you learned something cool today. I shall see you guys next week in class. Bye, my people.